Hello, I'm Sensei Alex Kakuya. The title of today's talk is Letting Go of Suffering. Before we get into that, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you'll be notified when I post talks in the future. If you wouldn't mind hitting the like button, that'd be great too. In the sutras, Buddha often says that we must stop clinging to the causes of suffering in order to realize enlightenment. And this sounds strange on the surface because if you ask people, do you want to suffer? 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you no. And yet, if we look at human history, we find that we as people are very good at creating problems and thus creating suffering for ourselves. More than that, even when we have a clear solution to our problem, oftentimes we'll continue in our wrong action rather than changing our behavior. Why is this? Why do we cling to the causes of suffering? And more importantly, how do we learn to stop? Well, to answer that question, we can look at a problem that many people are experiencing right now as we speak. It's autumn. Leaves are falling from the trees onto our front lawns, and for as long as there have been trees and lawns, leaves have been very good at taking care of this problem for themselves. If left to their own devices, the leaves will rot away, go into the soil, provide nourishment for the trees in the spring when new leaves form. We don't need to be involved in all, and yet we as humans interject ourselves into this near perfect natural system using our rakes and our leaf blowers to make big piles of leaves, bagging those leaves, and then paying someone to haul them off to a landfill. Why do we do this? It's an imaginary problem with an unnecessary solution, and yet I have a feeling we'll be doing this as long as there are trees, leaves, and leaf blowers that we can deal with. To understand why this happens, we need to understand Buddhism's teaching of the 5 aggregates, which states that our experience of the world comes about as a result of the amalgamation of 5 things, namely form, perception, sensation, mental transformation, and consciousness. The second noble truth of Buddhism states that suffering is caused by desire. However, more specifically, suffering is caused by our attachment to the 5 aggregates. So, for example, sensation means that we see something in the world and view it as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. A lot of our suffering as human beings is caused because we are attached to the aggregate of sensation, namely pleasant sensations. So we see candy, we eat some, the sensation is pleasant, so we eat a bunch more, like a lot of kids did on Halloween, and now we have a stomach ache. Thus, our attachment to the aggregate of sensation is the cause of our suffering, and by letting go of that attachment, by understanding that yeah, candy might taste good, but maybe we don't need to eat quite so much, we can end suffering for ourselves and others. This is true of all 5 of the aggregates. However, for this Dharma talk, we will focus on the aggregate of consciousness, which is an amalgamation of the other 4 aggregates, which is to say when form, sensation, perception, and mental transformation come together, consciousness, our sense of self, is the result. To put it another way, when we interact with the physical world with our senses, when we have thoughts about those interactions, that's how we know we exist. That's how we have a sense of a separate existence from the rest of the world. This is important because a lot of our suffering is caused by the illusion of a separate self and the maintenance of that illusion. Because if we don't have enough mental inputs coming in, if we're not feeling, touching, tasting, smelling enough things, our sense of consciousness disappears. And no one wants that. So we create situations that allow us to experience consciousness. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. We need consciousness to tell us not to run out into traffic. We need consciousness in order to tell us to feed ourselves when we're hungry. But if our attachment is too great to consciousness, it can create problems in the same way that our attachment to candy being too great can cause a stomach ache. A simple example of this is raking leaves. We all know intuitively that if we leave the leaves alone, they'll take care of themselves. But taking out the rake, raking the leaves, bagging them, putting them on the curb gives us that sensory input we want and supports our sense of self. It makes us feel real. And that's fine when we're talking about raking leaves, but what other portions of our lives are we creating problems for ourselves unnecessarily? Do we go on social media and look at tweets from people we don't like solely so that we can feel something, be it anger or irritation? Do we pick fights with our partner or our family member because we're bored and we don't know what else to do? If we create problems unnecessarily, we create unnecessary suffering to support our feeling of self. Thus, what we need to do is study our attachment to consciousness, study the problems in our lives and determine which ones are real problems we need to solve and which ones are made up problems that we can leave alone. Meditation is an effective way to do this. When we sit in meditation, we are training our minds to be okay with not all of that sensory input. Our nose itches, but we don't scratch it. Something pops into our head that we need to do, but we don't jump up immediately to do it. We have a feeling about sitting on the cushion, be it pleasant or unpleasant, but we don't move. We don't react to the mental triggers that are designed to cause us to have a sense of self. And as a result, those triggers slowly die away. And as they die away, we realize that our sense of consciousness can subside a little bit and we'll be okay. But this is a hard practice because the mind does fight back. We want to feel a sense of self. We want to feel separate from the world. We want to feel alive. So oftentimes when we sit in meditation, the mind will make up problems for us to solve. We'll suddenly remember that one thing we forgot to do, or we'll think back to something in our childhood that we didn't like, or something that might happen in the future that we have to deal with. This is why when we meditate, we have a focus of concentration. We practice single-pointed concentration, oftentimes by focusing on the breath. Our mind wanders off to some imaginary problem. We bring our focus back to the breath. We want to wiggle on the cushion to have a slightly more pleasant sensation. We bring our focus back to the breath. And as we do that over and over again 10,000 times, we realize that a lot of the problems we have in life aren't actually problems. So a lot of the noise dies away and we're actually able to focus on the problems that are real, the problems that aren't made up because we're bored and we're lacking a sense of self. Who knows? Maybe if we meditate long enough, we'll stop raking the leaves. Amitabha.